Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The kettle had just started to whistle when Martha stepped into the living room with her slippers scuffing gently against the floorboards. The house smelled of rosemary and roasted potatoes, the kind of Sunday aroma that always lingered until the next morning. Outside, Elkshore was wrapped in quiet, the kind that settles in small towns after church bells stop ringing. Martha adjusted the curtains to let in the last of the amber light and sank into her armchair with the ease of a woman who had earned stillness. On the screen, the television muttered softly, some talk show. She wasn't really paying attention. Her eyes were tired. Her hands, though idle, were folded in the familiar way of someone who had held on to many things for many years. The living room, with its lopsided bookshelf and threadbare cushions, didn't boast of wealth, but it told stories of patience, routine, and the kind of love that gets built in quiet corners. She had just picked up her tea, the steam fogging her glasses, when something shifted on the television. The sound changed. The crowd was cheering now, and a host's voice bounced through the room like a drumbeat. A surprise proposal, they said. A beautiful moment. The kind people dream of. She glanced up, indifferent at first. She had seen hundreds of these before, strangers in love, big gestures, teary eyes. But the sight that met her eyes was not a stranger. It was Daniel. Her Daniel. Kneeling. At first, her body didn't understand what her eyes were seeing. There he was, Daniel, wearing the very blazer he had claimed was too worn to pack, holding a small box in his hand, smiling as if the world were blooming at his feet. Martha blinked. Her tea tilted, spilling onto her lap, but she didn't react. The sound of applause on the television roared like ocean waves in her ears. The camera panned to a woman standing before him. Young, maybe in her late 20s. Chestnut hair in soft waves, trembling lips, mascara already smudged from emotion. Her name, Elena, was shouted gleefully by the host, and the crowd chanted her name like a fairy tale chorus. Daniel was speaking. His voice, too real, too familiar, came through the speakers. You changed my life, he said, his smile wide and eyes misty. Marry me. The woman's hands flew to her face. She nodded, over and over, her mouth forming the words yes, yes, yes. Martha sat frozen, her fingers trembling against the warm ceramic of her teacup, heart thudding somewhere near her throat. The air inside the room suddenly felt heavier. Her lungs forgot how to breathe. The cheering, the music, the flashing lights, all of it blurred into one deafening hum. It was a proposal. A public, national, recorded proposal. And her husband was the man on one knee. Time slowed, then stretched, then fractured. Martha's mind tried to make sense of what her heart had already recognized. Daniel had given another woman the dream he never gave her. Outside, nothing changed. The wind still rustled through the sycamore trees. The neighbor's dog barked at something unseen. A child's bicycle lay on its side near the curb, untouched since noon. But inside Martha's chest, something broke, not with a sound, but with an ache so deep it felt like a cavern had opened behind her ribs. It was the kind of pain that didn't scream, but lingered like smoke after a fire. She stood slowly, placing the cup back on its saucer like it mattered. Her legs felt like porcelain, delicate and hollow. The TV kept playing, rolling to the next segment, laughter, confetti, hugs. But Martha didn't hear it. Her focus was trapped in that moment, in Daniel's expression. It wasn't staged. It wasn't forced. He looked happy. He looked free. She turned away from the screen, walked toward the window, and stared at her garden, where the roses she planted last spring were starting to wilt under the weight of too much summer sun. She thought of the last 10 years, of birthdays Daniel missed because of work trips, of anniversary dinners she prepared alone, of the way he would smile at his phone and say it was just a colleague. Every dismissed suspicion now returned like shadows creeping across the floor. It hadn't been sudden. It had been growing beneath her nose like mold under wallpaper. And now, in one sweeping moment, it was all laid bare, for the world to see, for the town to witness, and for her to unravel in silence. The moment the front door opened 10 minutes later, Martha was still in the same spot, hands clasped over her stomach, staring at the horizon like she was waiting for something she knew would never come. The door creaked as it always did, and Daniel stepped in with a jolt, like a man thrown off balance by his own shadow. His hair was tousled, his breath uneven. The jacket he wore on television was still on him, only now it looked like a costume stripped of meaning. His eyes found her, and for a moment they just stared at one another, him wide-eyed and broken, and her hollow but standing. "Martha," he breathed, voice shaking. It wasn't." But his words stumbled over each other, colliding like drunk dancers. He looked like a man trying to outrun guilt, but it had already caught up. Tears welled up in his eyes, the kind that fall too late. "Please let me explain." He dropped to his knees, not with love this time, but with desperation. A begging posture. Not romantic. Not heroic. Just pitiful. Martha didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't even blink. The air between them stretched, brittle and sharp. In that moment, he wasn't her husband. He was a stranger wearing his face. A man who had taken something sacred and sold it for applause. The kettle, long forgotten, began to screech again from the kitchen. But Martha didn't hear it. Her ears were still filled with the echo of cheers from a stage she had never been invited to. Daniel remained on the floor like something discarded, kneeling not in honor but in guilt, as if the very weight of the moment had finally buckled his knees. He was crying now, choking sobs that filled the room in place of the words he couldn't seem to form. Martha stood still, not out of shock anymore, but because movement felt like too much. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was saturated with years of quiet sacrifices, lost trust, and unanswered questions that had accumulated like dust in corners she no longer cleaned. Daniel's hands reached for hers, trembling, but she pulled away without words. Her face was unreadable, but inside, everything was loud. The clocks ticked louder. The refrigerator hummed louder. Even the creak of the wooden floor beneath his knees rang in her ears like a drumbeat from another life. She didn't ask why. She didn't shout. She just walked away, past the kitchen, past the photograph still hanging crookedly on the hallway wall, past the coat rack where his rain jacket still dripped from the last storm. In the bedroom, she sat at the edge of the bed and stared at the blanket she had folded that morning, not knowing what was coming. Daniel eventually stood, his footsteps soft behind her, stopping at the doorway like a man not sure if he was welcome in his own home. When he finally spoke, his voice was thin, barely above a whisper. "It wasn't real. I mean it was, but it wasn't what you think." Martha said nothing. She was waiting, not for his story, but for the truth behind it, the kind he couldn't decorate with excuses or dress in apologies. There was nothing he could say that would rewind what had just happened. His proposal to another woman had been televised, witnessed, celebrated, and now, here he was, reduced to sobs and stammers, begging for a second chance from a woman who no longer knew if her heart had room for one. The hours that followed passed like shadows crawling across a wall, slow and shapeless. Daniel sat on the edge of the armchair in the living room, head in his hands, the remnants of his television stunt still clinging to his sleeves like residue from a fire. Martha remained upstairs for most of the evening, neither crying nor sleeping, but simply existing in that strange, numb space grief sometimes leaves behind. She wasn't mourning a death, not technically, but something had died, and funerals don't always come with coffins. Her phone buzzed endlessly, messages from neighbors, from friends, from distant relatives who had all seen it. She didn't respond. She deleted them one by one, her fingers cold and steady. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the windows like a whisper reminding her she was still here, still breathing, still caught in the middle of something she hadn't started. At around midnight, she came downstairs and found Daniel in the same position, as if frozen in regret. He looked up, eyes swollen, lips cracked from muttering apologies into the air. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that," he said. "It got out of hand." Martha leaned against the doorway, arms folded. Her expression hadn't changed, but something in her posture had. She no longer leaned toward him. She was pulling away, even if her feet hadn't moved. "Then explain," she said, her voice steady but hollow. Daniel ran a hand through his hair and began. He told her how it started months ago, at a gala in Ravenhill City. Elena was a colleague. They worked on the same planning committee. It was meant to be nothing, just drinks after a long event, just a smile held a second too long, just a conversation that slipped into something deeper. One thing led to another, and suddenly, he had stepped into a second life without ever closing the door on the first. He didn't mean to fall for her, he claimed. It wasn't about love, he insisted. But as he spoke, his words sounded more like confessions than explanations, and Martha's face didn't soften. He explained that Elena had applied to the television show without telling him. He insisted that he was shocked when the producers called to say they'd been selected. He didn't want to go through with it. He had tried to pull out, but Elena was persuasive. She had built expectations, told her family, made plans. The network had already arranged everything. I felt trapped, he said. It was all spiraling. Martha blinked slowly, her arms still crossed. So you went through with it anyway. Daniel nodded shamefully, like a student caught cheating with the answer sheet still in hand. I didn't think you'd be watching, he whispered. That sentence, more than anything else he had said, struck her. Not the affair, not the betrayal, not even the public humiliation, but the audacity of that one belief. That she wouldn't be watching. That she wouldn't know. That her world would remain untouched while he gave someone else the dream she had never received. Martha turned her gaze to the family portraits still hanging above the fireplace. 10 years of birthdays, vacations, and holidays, all captured in smiling snapshots that now felt like evidence of a lie. She wondered if any of it had been real, or if Daniel had been acting all along. And as she watched him, broken, messy, full of shame, she couldn't find it in herself to pity him. Because pity required a piece of the heart, and hers felt locked in a vault she couldn't remember how to open. The night dragged on, the hours leaking into morning with the cruel consistency only heartache can offer. Martha eventually made her way to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, her fingers steady but her throat too dry to swallow. Daniel hadn't moved from his spot. He looked like a man who had broken something he didn't know how to fix, like a boy who had played with fire and expected to walk away without burns. The silence between them stretched once more, but now it was no longer filled with confusion. It was filled with clarity. Martha knew who she was now. She was not the woman waiting at the window anymore. She was not the wife hoping for an apology. She was something else, someone else. She was becoming. Daniel, still unaware of this quiet transformation, continued to speak softly, offering regrets like pebbles tossed into a lake, hoping one would skip far enough to matter. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't love Elena the way he loved Martha. He said he'd end it. He promised things he hadn't promised in years. But Martha didn't reply. She didn't even nod. Because sometimes, forgiveness isn't a word, it's a wound. And hers wasn't ready to close. So she turned off the kitchen light, walked past him one last time that night, and disappeared up the stairs, leaving Daniel in the dim, uncertain glow of a house that no longer felt like home. Martha moved through the following days as though the world had grown quieter without her permission. It wasn't the kind of quiet that came from peace, but the aching stillness left in the aftermath of a sudden crash. The silence that settles after all the glass has shattered, but before anyone finds the courage to sweep it up. She no longer asked Daniel where he was going, nor did she glance at his phone when it buzzed against the kitchen counter. Her curiosity had died the night he walked through the door in tears, and what remained was a numbness that made everything look unfamiliar, even her own reflection. Mornings passed like fog, curling around her routines without shape. She still woke up early, still folded laundry, still watered the plants in the front garden, but her body did the work on its own, detached from the thoughts that crowded her mind. Sometimes, she would find herself staring at a spoon in her hand, unable to recall what she was about to do with it. She didn't feel like a woman in mourning, nor one filled with rage. What she felt, if it could be named, was suspended, caught somewhere between the person she was before and the person she hadn't yet become. Daniel noticed, of course. He noticed everything now. How she no longer asked if he wanted tea. How she slept with her back turned to him. How her voice, once filled with small kindnesses, now held no softness at all. He began tiptoeing through the house, his movements gentle, cautious, like someone trying not to wake a beast. But there was no beast here, only Martha, and the ghost of something that once felt like a future. He kept trying, in his own broken way, to stitch things back together. He came home early. He cleaned without being asked. He even began cooking again, something he hadn't done since their first year of marriage, when he still believed in candlelit surprises and long apologies. He spoke to her more gently now, as if kindness could erase betrayal, as if doing the dishes could somehow undo what he'd done on national television. Sometimes he would sit beside her on the couch and talk, about work, about memories, about nothing, and wait for her to join the conversation. But Martha only listened, never once interrupting, never once affirming. Her silence wasn't angry. It was distant, like a door that had been locked and no longer responded to knocking. Daniel could feel her slipping, like sand through his fingers, and yet he still believed, naively, desperately, that if he held still enough, she might stay. One evening, he brought home tulips, the kind she used to admire at the Sunday market. He placed them in the blue vase she had bought in Elkshore years ago, hoping she'd remember the trip, the laughter they shared when it shattered slightly in the car, and he promised to fix it with glue. She looked at the flowers and said nothing. Later, after he'd gone to bed, she moved the vase to the hallway table. Out of sight, not quite out of reach, just somewhere she wouldn't have to look directly at it. The truth was, Martha didn't know what to feel anymore. The anger that had threatened to rise in her chest had never fully arrived, and the sadness that curled around her at night wasn't the kind that could be cried out. It was deeper than tears, quieter than rage. It was the weight of realizing that love, once broken so publicly, didn't just shatter. It scattered, leaving sharp little pieces in places she never expected. A week after the televised proposal, Martha opened one of the drawers in Daniel's study while looking for an envelope and stumbled upon something she hadn't known existed. It was a small black box, nearly hidden beneath a stack of old paperwork, next to an unused fountain pen she had gifted him 3 Christmases ago. Her breath caught when she opened it. Inside was a ring, not flashy or expensive, but simple and familiar in its elegance, the kind of design she might have chosen herself. It was the sort of ring given with thought, with understanding, with time. Beneath it lay a folded note in Daniel's handwriting, dated nearly 6 months earlier. The paper was creased, aged just enough to make it clear this had not been planted recently. She unfolded it with trembling fingers and read words meant for her, a message written with warmth and intention, a promise to mark their 10-year anniversary with a ring that symbolized all the quiet love they had built together. "You've given me everything, and I know I haven't always deserved it. This ring is only a piece of what I owe you. You are my home." She read it twice, then a third time, and by the fourth, the words no longer carried comfort, but a bitter irony. He had once planned to give her this ring, to propose again, to celebrate a milestone not with a party or a trip, but with a simple act of devotion. And yet, somewhere along the line, he'd detoured so far into someone else's story that he'd forgotten his own. The ring had stayed in the drawer. Elena had received a different one, a shinier moment, a louder gesture, a proposal that was broadcast for millions. And Martha, the woman who had waited a decade without asking for more, had gotten silence. She closed the box, returned it to its hiding place, and walked away, her chest tight with something that was not quite pain, not quite clarity, but the first small tug of change beginning to stir beneath her ribs. That night, while Daniel slept beside her, she lay wide awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, tracing the faint shadows cast by the moonlight through the curtains. She wasn't crying. She hadn't cried once since the day it happened. Not because it didn't hurt, but because the hurt had gone so deep, it had settled into stillness. Her mind returned to the note, to the ring, to all the moments Daniel had once meant to make special but never followed through on. She thought about the way he had looked on that television screen, so certain, so alive, so willing to perform. It wasn't the betrayal of the body that cut deepest. It was the betrayal of intention. He had loved someone else enough to kneel before her, to ask in front of strangers for forever, while the woman he'd shared 10 years with received no ceremony, no moment, not even a whisper of that gesture. As the hours crept toward morning, Martha understood something she hadn't before, not just about Daniel, but about herself. She had given him her time, her forgiveness, her understanding, even before he asked for it. But now, as the night stretched its limbs across their bedroom, she realized she had nothing left to give. Not because she hated him, and not because she couldn't forgive, but because somewhere along the way, she had disappeared from her own story. And now, for the first time, she wanted it back. Not to prove anything, not to punish him, but because she finally saw the truth. She had been waiting for him to return home, when all along, it was she who had left herself behind. The days that followed moved like fog, formless, quiet, and unnervingly persistent. Martha found herself lost in patterns she no longer recognized. Routines that once held comfort now felt hollow, and time moved in a circle instead of a line. She folded clothes she no longer cared if he wore. She dusted surfaces he barely touched. Every drawer she opened seemed to reveal another version of her life that had gone unnoticed, filled with faded receipts from restaurants she never visited, name tags from conferences she wasn't invited to, and event flyers dated on weekends he claimed were too busy for travel. There was no confrontation, no explosion of rage or drama, only the slow, steady unraveling of belief. Trust, she realized, did not snap like a twig. It frayed like a threadbare sweater, losing its shape until one day it simply fell apart. She tried once to sit at the dining table and pretend it was a normal evening, just for the sake of familiarity, but the silence between them was too vast. Daniel tried to fill it with conversation, recounting harmless office stories and half-hearted updates about local news, but every sentence he spoke landed like a pebble dropped into a dry well. It made noise, but it echoed into emptiness. She studied him without letting her gaze settle too long. She watched his lips move and wondered how many lies they had held. Not just the grand ones, but the small ones, the "I miss you," the "you're all I need," the "you're the only one." How many of those were genuine, and how many were performances delivered for peace? He still left the cap off the toothpaste. He still forgot to rinse the coffee spoon. And somehow these tiny annoyances made her angrier than the betrayal itself, not because of what they were, but because they reminded her that even in the wake of disaster, some people simply do not change. One evening, while looking for an old phone charger in the attic, Martha stumbled across a cardboard box she hadn't seen in years. Its label read "Keepsakes" in her handwriting, faded and curling at the edges. She opened it slowly, not out of curiosity, but out of a need to touch something that still felt like hers. Inside were fragments of a younger life, letters they'd written before marriage, photographs from their first vacation in Pineberry, ticket stubs from concerts neither of them had enjoyed but attended because it felt like something couples should do. There were dried flowers from a bouquet he gave her the night she lost her job, and a birthday card she had nearly forgotten he once made by hand. Back then, their love had been messy and hopeful, the kind that doesn't know yet that time is a thief. She sat on the attic floor cross-legged, surrounded by the dust of forgotten years, and read the letters one by one. In them, Daniel had written like a man who believed in forever. He talked about how he couldn't fall asleep without her voice. He wrote about wanting children, about building a garden, about buying a house where they could grow old. She remembered those dreams, not because they had happened, but because she had waited for them to. Waited for him to keep his promises. Waited for life to align with the plans they once whispered under bedsheets in the middle of the night. But the garden had never been planted. The children never came. And the house they bought together now felt like a cage with too many rooms filled with silence. She closed the box, not with anger, but with a quiet reverence. These memories weren't lies. They had been real once. But what was real in one season could rot in another. Love, she realized, was not immune to time. And promises, no matter how sweet, were still perishable. The next morning brought with it a stillness Martha had not felt before. It wasn't peace. It was something quieter, something more resolute. She stood in the bathroom brushing her hair, staring at her reflection long enough to notice how her eyes had changed. They were less soft now, less round. There was a sharpness in them, a weight that hadn't been there before. Not bitterness, something sturdier than that. She got dressed with intention, not in the lazy comfort of loungewear, but in clothes she hadn't worn in months. She tucked in her blouse. She chose earrings. Daniel noticed, of course. He hovered at the kitchen door as she poured her tea, his expression a tangled mix of guilt and hope. "You look nice," he said cautiously. Martha offered a polite nod, but no smile. She wasn't doing this for him. She didn't need him to notice. What she needed, for the first time in a long time, was to feel herself inside her own skin. After breakfast, she stepped outside and walked through Elkshore's town square, past the bakery where old women still gossiped under sun hats, and the bookstore, where she once lost an entire afternoon reading poetry on the floor. People noticed her. Some offered stiff smiles, others looked away. She didn't care. Let them talk. Let them speculate. If anything, the whispers only confirmed what she already knew. Her life had stopped belonging to everyone else. On her way home, she passed by a church and slipped inside, not to pray but to sit. The stillness there felt different. Not empty. Not waiting. Just quiet. She stayed there for almost an hour, breathing in the hush, listening to nothing, until her chest stopped aching quite so loudly. When she finally stood to leave, she didn't take anything with her, no answers, no revelations. Just breath. Just space. Just the growing understanding that healing doesn't arrive in a moment. It arrives in pieces. And she had just found one. Later that week, as the sun began to dip behind the trees and the light painted long golden stripes across the living room floor, Martha heard a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, and Daniel was upstairs, likely immersed in one of the many articles he now consumed about rebuilding trust, as if redemption could be downloaded and studied. She opened the door and froze. Standing there was a young woman with hesitant eyes and trembling hands. It took only a second for Martha to recognize her. Elena. Her hair was tied back, her face bare, and whatever confidence had once carried her onto that stage had now been stripped down to raw uncertainty. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The breeze shifted. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. Elena took a breath and said softly, "I didn't come to defend myself. Her voice cracked. I just needed you to know. I didn't know about you. Not until the show aired. Martha's face didn't move. She stepped aside without a word, allowing the woman to enter. They sat in the living room, two strangers tethered by one man's duplicity, but now sharing the same quiet devastation. Elena didn't cry. Her hands remained clenched in her lap, and her words spilled slowly, without embellishment. She explained everything. The stories Daniel had told her. The excuses. The way he made her believe he was alone, unloved, rebuilding from a broken marriage. She had fallen for that version of him, the one who seemed full of sadness but still looking for hope. He told me you left him, Elena whispered. He said you'd moved away. Martha listened, her expression unreadable, not because she didn't feel anything, but because her feelings were too layered to wear on her face. And then, Elena reached into her bag and pulled out the ring, the very one Daniel had slipped onto her finger on national television. I don't want it, she said. It doesn't belong to me. I thought it did, but it never did. She placed it on the coffee table and stood. I'm sorry, she said before leaving. Martha stared at the ring long after the door had closed, her eyes fixed on the small, shining symbol of everything that had collapsed. Not because she wanted it, but because, for the first time, she realized she no longer needed it. The hours after Elena left were quiet in the kind of way that no longer startled Martha. The silence in the house had become familiar now, not comforting, but known. It clung to the corners of the rooms like dust that refused to be swept away. The ring sat untouched on the coffee table, small and unassuming, yet heavier than anything she'd held in her hands in years. She didn't rush to move it. She didn't touch it, didn't even glance at it again after those first few moments. It sat like a stone in the middle of her living room, silent proof of things no longer in dispute. The strange thing was, she wasn't angry with Elena. That surprised her more than anything else. She had braced herself for bitterness, for resentment to rise and take its rightful place. But none came. Elena hadn't stolen anything. The real theft had taken place in Daniel's choices, and no other woman, no matter how misguided, could be blamed for a man's decision to lie twice. Martha spent the rest of the evening moving through the house without urgency. She made tea and sat in the den with the window open, listening to the breeze shift through the trees. The night crept in quietly, and the moon hung above Elkshore like a witness with nothing to say. At one point, Daniel came downstairs and lingered at the doorway, looking from her to the ring and back again, but he said nothing. He didn't ask questions anymore. Maybe he sensed the tides had shifted in a way he could no longer read. Or maybe he was waiting for her to speak first. But she didn't. There was no conversation to be had. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. The next morning began like the ones before it, but with a stillness in Martha's bones that didn't feel like sadness anymore. Something had changed, though nothing in the house looked different. The furniture sat in the same places. The sun touched the floors just as it always had. But there was a quiet clarity in her movement now, a kind of invisible decision taking shape. She dressed in silence and tied her hair back neatly. In the kitchen, she moved with purpose, not rushing but not drifting either. Daniel watched her from across the table, his coffee untouched, his eyes searching hers for some cue he might respond to. He was still there, still lingering in the ruins of what had once been a marriage, still hoping that if he stayed long enough, something might return to him. But Martha wasn't returning anywhere. She was moving forward, though the direction was only beginning to form in her own mind. She had spent so long waiting, to be heard, to be chosen to be enough. And now, she wasn't waiting for anything. She placed a folder on the table near him, without ceremony. Inside were papers he hadn't seen yet. Documents. Bank details. A list of things to divide. A simple note written in her neat, deliberate handwriting. This is not revenge. It's not punishment. It's a beginning. Daniel stared at it for a long time, the color draining slowly from his face. He didn't touch the folder. His mouth parted slightly, as though words were forming but none came. Martha didn't look at him when she spoke. She just said, "I'm leaving at the end of the week," then walked away to water the plants she had almost let die during those first few weeks after the show. He followed her with his eyes, but not his feet. And in that moment, something finally reached him, something deeper than apology, sharper than shame. She was no longer asking him for anything. And that, he understood, was the end. In the days that followed, Martha packed without rush. She moved from room to room, sorting through years of accumulation, not with bitterness but with remarkable calm. There were things she left behind, things she knew had never truly been hers to begin with. A clock they bought together, but only he ever wound. A painting he chose that never suited her taste. Coffee mugs from cities she had never been invited to visit. She touched each item only once, deciding quickly, not because she was careless, but because she no longer needed to explain herself. She filled 2 suitcases with her clothes, a small bag of keepsakes, and a journal she had forgotten she once kept but now couldn't leave behind. She wasn't running away from the house, or even from Daniel. She was simply stepping out of a story that had stopped making sense. The neighbors noticed the change, of course. This was Elkshore. People noticed everything, especially when someone stopped pretending. There were whispers when she took her plants off the porch, when a moving van came and left without much ceremony. People glanced, speculated, asked quiet questions at the grocer. But no one dared confront her directly. Martha walked with a kind of peace now that was not warm, but resolute, and people sensed instinctively to leave it alone. Daniel didn't try to stop her. Not really. He hovered. He offered help she didn't accept. He cooked once, and left it on the table. But he didn't say the words he should have said months ago, and now it was too late. On the evening before her departure, he sat on the steps outside as she watered her last plant. "You really mean it," he said, his voice low. She looked at him, her gaze steady. Yes. There was nothing cruel in her voice. No triumph. Only truth. She left on a Thursday morning when the sky was overcast but dry, the kind of weather that offered no resistance, no distraction. Daniel stood at the door as she carried her last bag to the car. He didn't cry. He looked like he had already done all the crying he had in him. Martha paused at the driver's side, her fingers resting on the handle for a breath longer than necessary. Then she looked at him, not with anger or affection, but with a clear-eyed kind of farewell. "Take care of yourself," she said simply. He nodded. She got into the car, turned the key, and drove off without looking in the rearview mirror. As the town disappeared behind her, she felt no cinematic surge of freedom, no tears, no dramatic music rising in the background. Just stillness. She drove with the windows down, letting the wind pull at strands of her hair. There were no final words. No closure. Only movement. And that was enough. After all, some endings don't come with applause or witnesses or even relief. Some endings arrive like dusk, gradual, inevitable, and quiet enough to miss if you aren't paying attention. But Martha had been paying attention for a long time. And as the road stretched ahead and the past grew smaller in her mirrors, she wasn't thinking about what Daniel had done, or what she had lost. She was thinking about where she might go next. She didn't know the answer yet. But for the first time in a long time, not knowing felt like a beginning. The small town Martha arrived in days after her departure from Elkshore didn't have a name that stood out, nor landmarks that begged for attention. It sat quietly between stretches of low hills and winding roads, the kind of place where the wind carried the scent of old soil and the mornings started without alarms. She hadn't planned her destination. She had driven without a map, choosing turns by instinct and stopping when something inside her finally settled. The inn where she booked a room was modest, built of aging timber with ivy climbing up one wall. Her room overlooked a narrow river, its water moving slowly as though it, too, was healing from something. Martha unpacked only what she needed: 2 dresses, a pair of walking shoes, a notebook, and a framed photo of herself as a girl that she'd found buried in a drawer before she left. She'd almost forgotten what that girl looked like, smiling, sunburned, squinting into the sky without fear. There were no plans in place. No schedule. She allowed her days to unfold gently. She read by the window. She walked the quiet lanes where no one knew her name. She smiled at strangers and let their kindness pass through her without needing to hold on to it. For the first time in years, she felt unobserved, not invisible, but finally free of expectation. There was a freedom in that anonymity, like walking barefoot after a long season in tight shoes. And as she moved through those early days, a quiet truth took root in her. She had left not because she stopped loving, but because she had finally started loving herself. Back in Elkshore, Daniel moved through their now empty home like someone trying to live in a memory that no longer fit. The rooms had changed without changing. Her absence sat in every space, not as a dramatic emptiness, but as a missing rhythm. Her footsteps on the stairs, the quiet hum of her in the kitchen, the way she always opened the curtains just a little more than necessary. At first, he tried to hold on to routine. He made the bed every morning the way she used to. He brewed the same tea he never drank. He kept the porch light on longer than needed, as if light could conjure her shadow back to the door. But the house resisted him. It was never his alone. Everything good about it had been shaped by her, Her touch, her patience, her quiet. He wandered from room to room like a man who had inherited something sacred, but didn't know how to care for it. Friends reached out, some with caution, some with awkward sympathy. He avoided them. There was nothing to say. What could he possibly explain that hadn't already been laid bare for all to see? Regret followed him like a second skin, and not the kind that fades with time. It was the kind that made mirrors cruel and silence unbearable. Sometimes he thought of writing to her. Apologies, updates, memories, but he never did. There was nothing he could offer now that wouldn't sound like a plea. And perhaps for the first time, he understood the full depth of what he'd lost. Not just the marriage, not just her trust, but the quiet sanctuary she had built around him, the one he hadn't known he was living in until the walls were gone. Martha, in the meantime, began discovering things she hadn't remembered losing. She found joy in small details, the way the bookstore smelled of old paper and varnished wood, the way the baker in town always slipped her an extra pastry when he had won. She began to write again, not to document pain, but to remind herself that her voice had shape and weight. Her notebook filled with phrases and questions, half-formed thoughts about starting over, about time, about what it meant to grow past something without needing to erase it. She didn't hide from her past, she just stopped living in it. There were still quiet moments that carried echoes. She once saw a man with the same gait as Daniel and felt her chest tighten. Another time, she caught a familiar song drifting from a radio and had to step outside to breathe. Healing wasn't a straight path. It curved, it paused, it asked questions she didn't always want to answer. But still, she kept moving. She rented a small cottage on the edge of town with a garden just large enough for herbs and wildflowers. She began cooking meals just for herself and eating them at the table instead of standing by the sink. She painted the walls pale yellow and left the windows open during rainstorms. There was no one to impress, no one to clean up after. Her life became hers in a way it had never been before. She didn't think much about what Daniel was doing. She didn't need to. He was part of a chapter now closed, a necessary storm that had finally passed. She hadn't left to escape him. She had left to find the parts of herself that had gone quiet during the years she spent waiting. Seasons shifted. The trees shed their leaves and grew them back again. Time, in its patient and relentless way, pulled both of them forward. One day, months later, Martha received a letter with no return address. The handwriting was unmistakably his. She held it for a long time before opening it. Inside, there were no pleas, no promises, just a single page of reflection. He told her he understood now what she had carried, what she had given, and how little he had deserved it. He said he was trying to become a man who wouldn't waste what he'd once been given so freely. He didn't ask her to come back. He didn't write hoping to be forgiven. He wrote, it seemed, simply to say that he had learned. She read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. Not out of anger, not out of longing, just closure. That evening, she stepped outside with a cup of tea and sat beneath the tree at the edge of her garden. The air smelled of lavender and warm soil. The sky, streaked with orange and pink, reminded her that beauty wasn't always loud. It could be subtle, patient, even quiet. She closed her eyes and breathed in the moment, not the past, not the future, but the now. The stillness that once haunted her had become something else. It had turned into space. And in that space, she had made room for herself, not as someone's wife or someone's mistake, but as her own beginning. There were no fireworks, no dramatic revelations, just a woman, whole at last, sitting in the light she had found all on her own. Sometimes love doesn't leave with a bang. It slips away in silence, in overlooked moments, in broken promises dressed as normal days. If you ever find yourself waiting to be chosen, heard, or loved the way you deserve, remember, you are not a second option in your own story. Don't lose yourself trying to hold together what someone else is willing to let go of. Protect your peace. Honor your heart. And when it's time to walk away, do so not in bitterness, but in dignity, with your head high and your soul intact. Healing isn't always loud, but it is yours. May your heart never beg for the love it freely gives. May your silence never be mistaken for weakness. May you find the strength to let go of what no longer honors your spirit. May your soul be wrapped in peace, your mind in clarity, and your days in purpose. May you bloom in spaces you never imagined. And may every room you walk into recognize the light you carry. May you never settle for less than respect, loyalty, and a love that chooses you daily, without question. And may your healing be full, your joy unstoppable, and your story absolutely beautiful. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.